So great presentation. I'll just touch on the 4 or 5 points that really stick out for me, and I hope will help the policy sort of the next phase in terms of what to recommend in terms of next steps and policy. I mean, the first point I would like to make is that it's great to see political, policy, social research happening in an Indian city, and also an Indian city that's doing, fairly well. We're so used to reading about the Bihar and the Nitish miracle that I think to me really underlines the need to continue social policy analysis, to keep the research chugging, even when things appear to be going in the right direction. Because as Marie-Hélène said, the unintended consequences of one policy change on other policy areas is really important to know. And anyone who's been to Patna in the last few years knows that it's changed, but knows that it's still a fairly difficult place to live, work, travel, etc. in. So still a long way to go. I'm very pleased that Dennis and Shivani presented to the government of Bihar, and particularly the Bihar police, or the Patna police last week. I think it's great that there is an appetite for hearing what can be challenging research. And it's not just feeding the kind of the Bihar miracle, 10+% growth story. It's actually, some things are going well, but some things are going less well. That takes me to my second point, which for me is the core of my interest in urban violence. My chosen specialist subject these days is often working on domestic violence, so trying to work with the government of Bihar to design and implement an evidence-based strategy to address violence against women generally, but particularly domestic violence. So we heard in the presentation that a perception amongst those interviewed that violence against women and violence in the home had increased. Well, a point I'd make is Bihar, according to the National Family Health Survey 3 data, has the worst prevalence of violence against women and girls anyway. So even if it hadn't increased, we should still be very worried about it. And our own fieldwork, DFID's own fieldwork in Bihar, generally on the rural side in the last year, shows that the gender inequality and the roles and the perceptions that drive a high level of domestic violence are relatively unchanged. So I think that's a thing from the study to underline for me, and a sense that also Patna may seem safer, it may look safer. When I go, there's no longer a policeman standing outside my hotel room door with a gun. But if you're a woman in a slum, it may feel fairly similar as to how it did 10 years ago. I think a sense that the violence has been driven indoors. So we see in public, on the face of it, a reduction in the prevalence of violence. What may be coming out is actually it's been driven behind closed doors. There's still violence. There's still violent recourse or violent settlement of conflict, but it may focus on, inside the home rather than outside, spilling into the streets, spilling into a boring road or whatever. The public areas that people like I travel in. Which I think is a really important point. I mean, as someone who's been getting more and more quantitative in my research and fully appreciating the nature of the research, it'd be great to see the more hard-headed incidence data on violence and Dennis and Shivani's work on, fairly focused community work coming together, because there is a really interesting story to tell, and particularly on, what are the risk factors of things like alcohol, what are the additional risk factors of kind of work, socioeconomic status, etc. Because I think we have a really interesting point of history in India now. We do have quantitative data sets that are telling us something slightly different or nuanced about violence, particularly domestic violence, and it'd be great to marry those with Dennis and Shivani's approach. The third point I'd like to make is, I think that really jumps out to me is on alcohol, which I think comes out stronger in the paper, and maybe will be touched upon more in the second presentation. But the role of alcohol, not as a primary cause of violence, but as an accelerator or an intermediate factor. And talking to Dennis and Shivani, and from my own fieldwork in Patna and elsewhere, you always come across this thing of, there may be prevalent underlying conflict, but access to strong liquor on a regular basis. And the National Family Health Survey 3 data set on men who drink regularly and get drunk being, the women who are living with them being 3 times more likely than the average to be a victim of violence in the last year. I think alcohol is a really stark factor. It doesn't really matter how you describe it, but the number of incidents of alcohol, of violence that happen on an ongoing basis, alcohol clearly has a role. So what I'm imagining is, next steps from this, when does Bihar, when does Patna think about an integrated policy analysis at least on alcohol. I know from my own work in governance with the government of Bihar that there is a revenue miracle story in terms of excise and prohibition, in terms of addressing the liquor production mafia, the bottling mafia, the distribution mafia, all the mafias were squashed, 5+ years ago now. And we know that alcohol is more regulated, the quality that you can get is more reliable, the price has actually gone down for government-regulated liquor, etc. But we also know and sense that means that more people are getting access to alcohol closer to home and probably drinking more. So I think that there's a need for policy analysis on revenue versus health cost, revenue versus social cost. Where should Bihar like to fix the sort of needle? I think liquor-based revenue is still the largest state-owned generator of revenue. And how much money does Bihar need to generate from liquor versus what are the social and health and other costs of having a fairly high drinking culture? So for me, the alcohol question is a big one. I would say that this revenue sort of trade-off between stopping gambling and starting liquor, I think is actually speculative and maybe a small part of the story. I mean, I know that in, I think, 067 to 078, Bihar doubled its revenue take on alcohol, on liquor. So I think that the alcohol story is way beyond the gambling story. And Bihar, frankly, needed to clean up the illegal liquor situation. So I think the final point I make is, and I've touched on it with alcohol in terms of this is great anthropological research, where to locate it in you might say public policy. So we've touched on alcohol. I think in the next presentation you'll pick up again on the sanitation, on the conflict over water and sanitation. Now for me that's an interesting niche because this is yet another reason why we should provide safe water and safe latrines to all people in India, whether they live in urban slums or in rural villages or whatever. I do worry that yet another study saying it's important may not be enough to actually get anyone to do anything about it. You know, there are many more reasons why you'd address the need for latrines without even getting into urban violence. But I guess it may be the straw that broke the camel's back. Great that the police have seen the presentation and that they were positive about it. It'd be interesting to follow that up in terms of, well, policing for modern Bihar, what should it look like? If it is keeping the peace in the areas that people see from the outside but not in the slums, well, that is a concern. So a conversation about, well, where next for policing in Bihar? I think the final area that really jumps out for me is on land insecurity. Patna, we know land values are allegedly on par with Delhi. We know that there's a huge appetite for land, and if you visit, you can see the city getting bigger, but by the day, really, in terms of new farmland being zoned into what will be residential colonies. I really worry that actually there is no policy traction on that. That the stakes just so high that regardless of what you say about encroachment of slums, is will it really matter? Bihar is growing. It needs to grow. It needs to find land for manufacturing. It needs to find land for the surging middle classes to live in. So would any fact or any evidence or any data really interrupt that? So I am worried about that one. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you.
My thanks to Professor Alak Sharma and the research team for this invitation. For me also, I join Professor Papula in saying that it's quite a refreshing research area for especially people like us who've been working on urban policies for a long time, where I think there's been overwhelming emphasis on urban areas as the engines of economic growth, and following from that an emphasis on infrastructure and then urban planning. So I find this very interesting as because it does open up an interesting avenue for policy debates. And I think that's where the importance of this research would lie. At least I would look at it in an Indian context. Of course, Patna as a research locale is also refreshing, given that there have been studies on only select mega cities in India. So I think we are building up knowledge on different cities in India by such studies. I mean, there are great, I think if with proper policy linkages, this would be a very, very useful study in discussions on and deliberations on urban policy. And that's where I might like to add and suggest to you how certain issues that I think need to be more clear. First is, I think, there's need, as Mary Ellen is saying, but from other count is more clarity on the conceptual issues. There are different types of violences that we have. Coming from a state and coming from a city which is a rich business city with high violence level, that's Ahmedabad. So it's not only poverty alone in Indian context that might explain violence. And in fact, the extent of violence in some of the more developed states is much, much higher than the description that you have given of the violence in Patna, which is less per capita incomes and high poverty levels. I think that's a conceptual issue which you might want to grapple with. In that case, if you were to categorize or have a more nuanced understanding of types of violence, that might help you in probably moving ahead in this direction. As coming from developed states, and my research is in Gujarat, Maharashtra, where we find much higher state violence. And I think in the Santiago case study in a lot of Latin American countries, there's been discussion on state violence. And researchers have started talking about, as a reaction to that, an insurgent citizenship concept. John Holston has been discussing and written a lot about it. With state itself having a particular character, and as a response to that, citizens respond to a particular character of state from which the violence as an idea emerges and phenomena emerges. So I think might want to, this is one form that could be there. You did mention about Bihar's particular character about Naxalite violence, which is a kind of a counter violence to the political violence of the established. I do wonder why that's no reference and nothing found in Patna city. Is there totally devoid of the thing? Maybe because in Andhra Pradesh and other states where there is also this movement present, you do find its repercussions on the urban areas. So that is another kind of violence that one would want to probably look into. Gandhiji did talk about societal violence of established castes on the people. So is that the perspective of your violence? That's the third way of looking at violence. In states like Gujarat, where you've seen a lot of communal violence, it's an engineered political violence. There is criminalization of politics and violence as a consequence of that. So I think there are different perspectives on violence, and we might want to look more clear perspective on violence. That what is that you're looking at in this? And that would probably then explain your research question, because this paper as it stands now, it's not yet very clear with regards to the research question. And that's why we are in this situation where the slums are crime centers as a idea that may come out, and which is quite a big issue with regards to the way the question has been, research has been put forward. So if research questions and framing of it could help us in consolidating the research that has gone in. The other thing is that if we might like to have more clarity on all these terms that you've been using, seems to be interchangeably used, though you said conflict and then this tipping point of violence. But then once again, I think as far as the case study, the ethnographic studies that you presented, it's just a blurring of lines between these concepts that are there. And then there's the third concept that you've used is crime. So this clarification on this concept, crime, conflict, violence, etc., need to be done to explain. So that might be more useful. We also find in many cities there are geographies of violence. There are certain areas within cities we are more violent than we've experienced more violence than the others. So maybe Patna, I don't know. I don't know Patna very well. That was it. And last, I think, for people like us would be this linkages with terms of policy. Very clearly, in the large cities in developed states, the violence emerges from the politics on land. very clearly. There's land capture and violence that comes as a reaction to it. And you did cite an example of a private sector, which is capturing the land with the state support. I mean, that's a large-scale phenomena in very large cities. So, or else it is violence because of the lack of services. So there are different policy implications, and if we'd like to have more discussion on policy implications out of this in a city which is in a less developed state, because that's the context. You've dealt with the political economy very well in the paper. So the policy linkage of the study will be much more elaborated, would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for giving this opportunity to reflect on the paper which was made available to me only yesterday. I did get a chance to interact with both Danish and Shivani last week, both in Patna and also little in Delhi. And when I got this draft this morning, I went through it, I would not say rigorously, but had a chance to understand casually what's being written about. So, Arak Sharma ji, thank you for giving this opportunity. I went through the draft this morning, and first of all, before my reflections, I would like to just explain where I come from. I have three schools. One that I was a student of social anthropology or comparative sociology in D school long back. Then I was a student of policing, in the sense that I was a member of Indian Police Service for almost 20 years, quit, and now I'm a student of media, having own company into communications management. There are three standpoints from where I can see the paper. Yes, that's the first-hand account of Patna. And I had the privilege to attend the first workshop which you organized in Patna in Hotel Moria. The impression that I got going through your draft this morning, that it reminds me of the District Gazetteer, which we were supposed to read when we joined civil services. And the last District Gazetteer of Patna was written almost about 50 to 60 years back. Year I do not remember exactly, but a wonderful account of the city that it was, not the district that it was. And there is a very interesting resemblance between that and this, that it talks about Patna. It doesn't clarify whether it is Patna district or it's Patna town or the city. Naturally, as you go on, as you move on, you realize that it's talking about the tipping points of urban conflict. And as you further move on, you get a little confused, because if I were to write this, I would have written the role of state or market or civil society. And the dynamics, perhaps that's at work. And first of all, on the one hand, I must congratulate for the rigor of the draft that you submitted to us, but I would also submit that it doesn't give me a very clear sense of direction which I am supposed to take while I am reading the paper. It doesn't navigate me to a point very clearly. Maybe it's a little premature to jump at this conclusion, but few quick points. One, coming from my policing background. 1995 to 1990 to 2005. That was Lalu Prasad Yadav's regime, directly or by proxy. First half he was there directly, second half his wife. And we see that the crime was high but under control. To an outsider it seems quite a contradiction in terms, but to anybody who has been in the game of policing would understand this very, very clearly. In the sense that there is a concept of burking in police. Burking means minimization while reporting crime. So if a murder has taken place in a particular area, you will find two police stations fighting, whether it's his jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of other guy. You will find situations where they would take up the gray area cases by saying there is no apparent violence mark on the body, dead body, and hence it may be a natural death, and hence there's no need for postmortem and stuff. So this is one. But invariably in the case of murder, the gray areas that you find are quite limited. You don't have discretion to dismiss a murder case outright so easily. But you have cases where they have played around with that. But in other cases, as you move on, you will find that 307, if you go to a police station, there are 20 crimes listed in a police station across the country. Not only in Patna, but even in Delhi, where I was in 3 districts. It starts with murder, attempt to murder, robbery, dacoity, robbery, burglary, theft, burglary by night, burglary by day, then rape, and then it comes to another category called local and special laws. As Danish clearly mentioned in his document, that the data that he has picked up doesn't pertain to local and special laws. That means it doesn't really analyze excise cases, gambling cases and stuff, though he has touched upon the area, but he couldn't get his hands on the statistics. But even the core area, 1990 to 2005, you would find that there is a serious attempt on the part of the state to the police officers on the ground not to register the case. And despite that, you find that the perception of crime was very, very high, but the reporting of crime was not as high. It was high, but not as high as the perception was. And this was primarily because of the attempt to not register cases, which is called burking technically in police. You find soon after that a new regime with new promises and new directions, signals going to the ground to act otherwise. And there are two trends. One, that the body crime has not really gone down, but the property crime has gone up. And this is rather natural, because property crime, the possibility of burking is little more. And therefore, if the direction is that register more and more cases, there are chances that you will get more of robberies, more of dacoities, and more of burglaries. The difference is quite technical. Robbery is that if I come to you, show you a knife, take your some valuables, it is robbery because I used a weapon and caused little violence to you while taking it off. So it's robbery. If I get into your house, take away something, it is burglary. If I come in a group of 5, it is dacoity. Now while reporting, while you say that, look, 10 people came, the police station people start quizzing you whether there were 10 or 5, are you sure, or you are colorblind, or it was night or a day, and they will make you convinced that they were not actually 5, they were less than 5, and then you say maybe I was a little sleeping that time, I'm not very sure. So they say if that maybe is true, then it is not dacoity, it is robbery. Hence, you will find that the number of cases have gone up, but if you go into the micro scenario, you will find the robberies are less, the theft are more. And if the theft cases are more, naturally the quizzing of the police officer is less, by their seniors, by the media, and also by the politicians, who look at these crimes very, very hawkishly. Not the ruling party, the opposition. They have a tool to beat the government if the crime situation is going little up. I hope the study gets a little into the dynamics of burking. I can speak a little more, but because of the constraint of time, I am just suggestively indicating this is a very prime area which has been somehow been omitted in the paper, and if your analysis goes a little deeper, you will get an idea of what it is. I'm open to discussion post this, and I can give you an idea of how to go about. The second is, of course, if you were to, I studied in school in Kolkata, and for my Delhi school in Delhi, and I was in Patna naturally. So I had a chance to see slums of these three cities. And that's how when Danish was presenting his paper, I asked him what is the caste composition, and to my not surprise, I was expecting it. He said only one upper caste, that to Brahmin.
Only in one slum.
Or that too in one slum.
But
If
there are more in others, but only 5%.
5%. But if you look at the slums of Delhi, there are two very interesting differences you find. In Patna, there is a continuum between the poor area and the rich area. And the poor also do not really feel that poor, and the rich do not know whether they are really rich. So there's a kind of a flow from one part to another. But in Delhi, it is quite stark. And if you look at, I was in South Delhi, I have served in 3 districts of Delhi. If you look at the South Delhi, which is the poshest till now, most of the areas which are very, very prosperous have a backyard of slums. And most of the services in the households, like washerman, like cobbler, like maid servants, etc., they are supplied from the backyard. They would not like to see these characters in the drawing room. They would not like to see them really in the forefront, but the fact remains that all of them come from your behind. They serve and they are supposed to vanish. Unlike that, in Patna, you will find that there is some kind of a integration. The dai in the house is not a no-no character if a very prosperous relative comes. She's a part of the house. So you introduce your child and you also introduce so-and-so dai. Meaning thereby that community structure between and the symbiotic relationship between rich and poor is a little better and stronger as compared to what you see in Delhi. You will find in Delhi there are a number of Brahmins, there are a number of Rajputs. You go to Sangam Vihar, you go to Ambedkar Nagar, you go to Mangolpuri, Sultanpuri. It is a very, very interesting mix. And there you see how OBC or even a SC who is selling better andas on the road and staying next to another guy who is selling something else which brings less money, throwing the poor caste, the lower caste is throwing weight on the upper caste. This you see in Delhi, but in Patna the traditional overlap of class, status and power is still quite prevalent, and that's how you have SCs and you have OBC 1 and OBC 2 in the slums. This I am mentioning to you because maybe a little of comparative references would highlight the dynamics at work. If you look at the slums of Calcutta, the partition, huge migration, 71 war, huge migration, and that's how you have slums and slums and slums majorly. So the East Bengal and the Bengal divide is pretty sharp, and the Bengals have a sense of superiority about their culture and high culture and stuff. So how the intercity slum areas, that kind of analysis will bring a little, bring sharpness to your study. Third point, you raised a question as to why police doesn't really bother about the land tenure related conflicts. I would say that this is a little oversimplification of the fact, because they do take interest, a rather very serious interest in land tenure, conflict matters, but the problem is that in the urban area, though there is a land, there is a conflict, but the valuation part is so less that, they audit their own energy and they feel that it is too trivial amount to focus upon. And this is universally true, not only in Patna, but also in Delhi elsewhere. After all, the policeman also has 24 hours and they also have limited energy, so they put their energy in areas which fetch them more. And not necessarily because this is one, when you ask them, they take a technical position. We also used to ask this question to guys that if there is a call of land conflict, say in CR Park or in Greater Kailash, immediately they would respond. But there is a similar PCR call in Sangam Vihar, police would reach after 3 hours. Not because police doesn't want to intervene. When we used to ask them, they used to say that, look sir, this is a non-cognizable offense. And non-cognizable offense would mean that police is not supposed to intervene. So these are civil matters, so guys should go to the court why they should come to police, and therefore if police has not gone, technically they are right. But that is not to say that they don't go. They go, depends how strong is the stake. But slum being slum, naturally when they fight over trivial matters, and there are smaller lots to take care of that, so they don't really waste their energy on that. But if you were to compare that slum of Patna with a richer part called Patliputra colony of Patna, and see the police response on land disputes or tenancy disputes or ownership disputes, then I'm sure your impression would be little far more nuanced. Last. Last but not the least, my submission is that while you have beautifully paraphrased the transition from Jangal Raj to Daruga Raj, I do not know what value paradigm you have in mind, which I would like you to explain a little. Because Jangal Raj as it is, nobody likes, but whether you would like to have a Daruga Raj, if at all, because these two, both these Jangal Raj and Daruga Raj still exist. And depends where you are getting into research. Thank you very much, Danish, and congratulations to both of you. And thanks, Alak sir, for giving the opportunity.
Friends, the panelists have made very significant points on violence, on its understanding, particularly in the context of Patna. I would like to make a few very brief observations before I hand over to you for discussion from the floor. While I appreciate this attempt, this study, which concentrates on crime in Patna, and I think, and I hope more such studies are taken up for various cities, I think the study of a particular town or city has to be put in a little broader perspective of the country as a whole. What types of crimes, sources of crimes are emerging, sources of violence are emerging in the country. I am also new to the subject, so I haven't given much thought to it beforehand, but on a quick thinking, I think a few broad categories of violence can be certainly identified. One can go into further details. One to which Papola also hinted at is the scarcity-induced conflict or violence, which is more directly related to situation of poverty, and which is perhaps the most traditional type of violence which emerges, because we have lived in a scarcity syndrome for decades and decades, for centuries in fact, and therefore now this type of violence arises from competition for spaces, space for living, space for work, space on the footpath, space for a little dhaba or a little space for competition for spaces, competition for scarce facilities like water, toilets in slums, and such other common facilities. And they give rise to violence almost on daily basis, the most traditional type of violence. In fact, the conflict between the local people and the immigrants is a subset of this conflict induced by scarcity, because when there are more immigrants, they would compete for the same scarce resources, whether it is space or some other facilities, and the violence would get aggravated. Then there is, in more recent years, and perhaps the parts of the country which got advanced, as Ms. Darshini mentioned, much before the country as a whole came to a high growth regime, have experienced a type of violence which can be described growth-induced violence. For lack of anything else, I would say growth-induced violence. Now, this growth-induced violence particularly arises for claiming a larger share of growing pie. A share of growing pie comes in a normal course of work and profession, but it is demonstrated by the behavior of others that a larger share of this growing pie can be claimed by violence and conflict. So land mafia is a subset of this. Land mafia, grabbing land. Kidnapping of rich people is, I think, a part of it, because kidnapping is not done just, it is very, very, whether it was in Patna or it is in Ghaziabad. In fact, I would think there were, even in those days, when you describe Patna as the capital of crime, Indian capital of, I think that's highly exaggerated. Even in those days, there were more kidnappings in Ghaziabad and Meerut than in Patna. But Patna fell into a different category. I will come to that. That is why it got a little more news value. And then there is this crime or violence related to asserting one's new social status. And this is not a small thing. Asserting all of a sudden the neo-rich. All of a sudden you have gained money, but you find that in society, your social status is still not in proportion to the wealth that you have gained. So you want to assert. So road rage is a form of this. A neo-rich is driving a BMW and somebody comes and just touches the car, and there is a violence of extreme type, shooting, death. This is happening almost every alternate day in Delhi. The road rage. And then there are other ways of showing your social status, which this is well. Then yet another category, I would say, which has been there for quite some time, violence and conflict as a source of extending political power. I think we should not ignore this type of violence. And in fact, what happened in Patna during a certain period was that this type of violence had increased, and therefore also it got more news value. But this was happening elsewhere also, perhaps at a larger scale, but for a variety of reasons, the news value of Patna violence was more. So therefore you see every almost political party sponsoring or taking under its own umbrella well-known criminals because they extend the influence. There are criminals who live in jail, fight elections, win the elections. They exercise great political influence sitting in jail inside. Once I was visiting Ghazipur, a district in eastern UP, a few years back. In UP, generally the electricity availability was at that time 8 hours out of 24 hours in general. But a few cities were more privileged, like Lucknow being capital, and there was in the western Etawah, or the city of Mulayam Singh, and some important political leaders. They were getting, so I asked the people, there were government officers sitting there. I asked for how many hours you get electricity. They said, we are among the privileged few we get electricity for 20 hours. I said, how come? It is neither a capital nor a constituency of a very big leader. He said, no, we are a constituency of Mukhtar Ansari who lives in jail, but it is his edict that city should get electricity for 20 hours and nobody can violate it. This is the type of political influence you extend. And without any exception, every party, either more openly, some in a hidden way, sponsor such powerful criminal elements because sometimes they are like Robin Hood, doing some good here and there. That is how they gain power. So that raises violence. Now, it's very well known. How do you compare crime of one type with the crime of another type? Crime in one city, total crime situation in one city, total crime. Can we say the crime in Bombay underworld with its international connections, international political influence has existed since long time. It also results in violence. It results in many other, but not so visible crime like a kidnapping or rape, which happens and gets in the news. Is that a smaller crime than, a few kidnappings? How do you measure? And in Delhi, or in the closer environments of Delhi, the satellite towns, particularly more notorious being Ghaziabad, Western UP, and the type of crime which has existed. I think one has to give a thought how to compare. And therefore, there was a phrase here, Patna as the crime, was known as the crime capital of India. I think these type of phrases are not only exaggerated, but highly exaggerated. Patna at the most would fall in the category of traditional crime, and for some period of time, the politically induced crime, which might include kidnappings and some influence, but many other parts of the country are not devoid of it. Now, I cannot give an exhaustive classification of crime because I just started thinking about it here. But I think there is a need to put the whole crime situation in a perspective. And what is a greater matter of concern, particularly to me, is the growth-induced crimes, which are rising at a much higher rate. They are much more violent. They need very little trigger, very little provocation, like road rage, I think, and just amount to very. And they have created a situation where living in a big city like this becomes, even, I suspect, even crime like rapes in a city like this, part of it is a crime to assert social status. Part of it, not the whole of it, but part of it, because some people became rich and then they don't know how to assert their importance. There are many other ways, and this could be one. Therefore, I think there is a need to put the whole thing in a little larger perspective. At the same time, I appreciate this research. This is a very important venture and should be done one by one in more cities so that we get a better perspective. With these few remarks, I will open it for discussion from the floor. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hear comments from the floor, but I thought I just wanted to make 2 or 3 points of clarification. Particularly, I wanted to clarify this issue about poverty and violence. We're absolutely not saying that there is a link about poverty, between poverty and violence. We're actually, our starting point is taking what the conventional wisdom is, that there is a link, and saying, and starting from that to actually take it apart. And actually what our study shows is that slums are violent in Patna, not because of poverty, but because of the state's action and targeted policing, which actually is a cause of violence in poor areas. The link between violence and poverty is much more one whereby the poor are being violented by the rich, in that sense. And I think and it's obviously something we'll have another look at in the working paper, because I think if there's any chance that kind of an amalgamation can be made about crime, slums equals crime, in a simplistic manner, that's a real problem. I think the other thing to be said about this study, this is very much a study of perceptions. It's about people's perceptions of what's going around them. And as we know, everybody, first of all, everybody lies, but then also everybody has different perceptions. And when the slum dwellers tell us, their perception is that domestic violence has increased, they're obviously believing that. Now, and we did ask, has it increased since 2005? They said, yes, we think it's increased since 2005. I think, and there may be other perspectives, other material which actually contradicts that, but the perception from within the slum is that. And just to sort of pick up the other thing about contextualization, I mean, the other thing about contextualization, India, in terms of the accepted measures of violence, homicides and so on, is not a particularly violent country, globally. And India has got very low homicide rates. Patna, and also the title of crime capital of India is actually a newspaper construct, but it's a newspaper construct on the basis of National Crime Record Bureau statistics. So if it's an exaggeration, then there's something wrong with National Crime Record Bureau statistics. But coming back to the idea about the thing is that there's other forms of violence. I mean, India has got huge forms of structural violence, and there's extremely spectacular forms of violence which come up episodically. Now, we link up to some of these, and I think ultimately the study links up to the fact that it's placed within a broader political economy, as Marie-Hélène in particular is saying, that it's about kind of structural forms of violence and oppression in some ways. So that's, I think I just wanted to clarify those before getting comments from the audience.
Thank you.
Can I, sir, respond to one of his, if you have permission?
Let's collect.
Okay.
I'm Rohit Jha. I've basically had a background in urban infrastructure development projects and urban financing. Purely from an analytical point of view, I think it would make a lot of sense, the suggestion made by Mari about comparing the incidence of violence in slums versus the middle class. Because what we find that unplanned development of cities often leads to differentiation in provision of services, which itself leads to a lot of violence and violence-induced crime. That is point number one. The second point, taking a cue from Uday, an ex-police officer, it would make a lot of sense to think in terms of all those different types of crimes and the sources of crimes and their recording by the police. Essentially, because a lot of times the records do not speak for themselves, and then look at it from the point of view of your perceptual market survey, because you talked about a lot of this being dependent on perceptions. So the results of your survey versus the records of the police, that analysis would be useful.
A couple of questions, very interesting, of course, Dennis and Shivani, but I had two issues basically on which I just want to kind of throw up an issue. One, the intensification of policing that's being talked about. By what factual information or on what basis is that being said? Is there any way in which you're actually looking at what kind of policing it is? Is it protective, preventive, punitive? Obviously not punitive, because you're saying the perception of the people that police brutality is an issue does not seem to be appearing. Because that will have consequences on how you think that is leading to a certain kind of trade-off from certain kinds of conflicts-related crime to other kinds of crimes. And this I link to the other issue that you're talking about in terms of crimes against women or domestic, the unintended consequences as you refer to it, in terms of containment of conflict. It's a little difficult to see the manner in which the rational logic or the objective logic of this is flowing. There is a decline in the reported crimes of the NCRB with or without the problems of burking and other kinds of things. The NCRB.
Only a decline in violent crime.
Yeah, decline in violent crime. And you kind of talk about a trade-off with an increase in domestic violence, which is both data and perception of people. Am I correct in saying that? Is that how it is?
Define data.
It's more perception.
Because of course the data is hugely deficient. On
That's right.
anything
That's
to do
right.
with, domestic or gendered violence.
That's right. That's right. So it's basically the perception. Now, my problem stems from the fact that when we are relating the two as a trade-off, we need to develop a construct around which we're doing this. Because what it seems like is if there is more policing and a containment of conflict, whatever be the source of the conflict and the areas and arenas in which the conflict is emerging, that is leading to a certain anger and a kind of an enclosing or encasing of the anger and conflict being let out in public spaces, which is actually resulting in domestic violence. I'm sure that's not how you want it to be read. But that's how it seems if you talk about it as a trade-off. So some clarity on what is it we are actually talking about when we are saying there is a trade-off in terms of a particular domain of violence shifting to another domain of violence. Because the more pertinent issue in the context of domestic violence, as people who worked on crimes against women know, and some research shows, is one, of course, the non-recognition of crimes against violence and therefore the non-reporting. Two, the non-recognition of the victims themselves and the low perceptions or the low valuation of their own rights, which results in certain kinds of reporting and therefore recognition of what forms of violence are recognized as violence. In a society which is existing at the levels of deprivation and poverty as it exists, and the slum terrain that you're talking about, the levels of general violence would be so high that a recognition that domestic violence is increasing needs to be viewed in that perspective. What does it actually mean? Is it actually some kind of sense of some empowerment of women or recognition of women as individual entities which is leading to this recognition of the increasing domestic violence? Or what kinds of variations or change in form is the domestic violence taking would be of some interest.
Dennis, I think that some of the questions which Professor Hasim raised and Dr. Papola on livelihood-related conflict, all those, the survey that you have conducted, more than 700 households, I don't remember now, it is a 15-page questionnaire. I think it was well designed. We pre-tested several times. I think you can categorize occupations, self-employed, wage labor, on the basis of income, whether it may be insufficient data also. But even then, it will give you sufficient differentiation between the various categories of households. Then in your survey, you have also asked, this is also perception survey about crime, whether crime has increased, a small crime has increased, big crime, what has happened. Your focus group discussion is a dialogue, very well done, but this perception survey was also done by the same group of people. I think if you correlate, I see many problems with economists, but also some problems with anthropologists like you. You don't use quantitative data. I think now that you have got both, it will be very interesting to use both. I know limitations of both. I have done focus group discussions, not as scientifically as you, honestly speaking, but these girls were in towns. They were always saying people were trying to, in course of focus group discussions, lying because they wanted some benefit. So in the quantitative, this perception survey and also some perception survey in the entire survey, this is a robust questionnaire. After pre-testing 2-3 rounds, I think that part has not been used properly in this study. You had asked questions about violent crime, about resources, about small crimes, about several perceptions. If you present those things, it will make it much more interesting. I think it will enrich it.
Hi, I'm Sonal Marva with the Small Arms Survey. First of all, Danish and Shivani, congratulations on the study. I just have a question about the police intervening comment that you spoke about a lot, and Mr. Uday Sahai spoke very candidly about police priorities in the urban sphere. But for me, it really touches on the point of looking at the civilian's perspective as well in terms of access to justice. If the police are not performing on their end, how do civilians see that? And for me, that it touches upon looking at it from a rural, urban, and peri-urban perspective, that in the urban spheres, perhaps civilians have more means and avenues to actually acquiring justice, be it influential means, be it they're more aware of their rights, be it the fact that the police are more visible in urban spheres, right? So it's a gap for me in your study that you're not touching on urban and upper class inhabitants to sort of look at the entire spectrum of police role in sort of ensuring public or personal security in your study. And the second point that I wanted to make is you use crime indicators, and this is it's one easy way, the annual tally of crime deaths, robberies, thefts, it's an easy way for us to look at sort of perspectives of violence and crime. So I think it's actually very useful that you've used perceptions and narratives to complement your study, and that sort of makes it more richer in your findings. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you. I'm Bajit Grewal from Victoria University in Melbourne. I'm not an expert in this area, but my comments are basically based on what I've seen today and what I've heard today. So if there is more in the paper, then please excuse me for misunderstanding the content. The point that I want to make is that it appears to me that the inclusion of poverty reduction in the title of this presentation is problematic, as has been hinted by a couple of other people as well, because it's not quite clear from your conclusions what conclusion do you draw about the link between poverty and poverty reduction and violence. It's also not very clear from your recommendations how you draw the recommendations from your information. I think methodologically it will be very helpful both for you and for the readers to be clear about what are your data telling you, what are your survey data, what are your secondary data telling you, and how do you link the discussion of those data with the conclusions and with the recommendations. Probably a starker way of putting it would be that several of your recommendations would have been drawn without any data, you see. I mean, they have no relationship, you see, with the data, I don't think, particularly the last 2 or 3. So I think it would help the quality of the paper and the quality of your report as well. And finally, I thought that this was a study which is a part of a broader study of 4 cities, and there is no mention in this presentation about how it relates to your observations or observations of a broader project in other places. So I think that would also help if that was rectified. But otherwise, the topic is very interesting, and it has a potential to make some impact on the policies as well. So I think in that sense, congratulations. It's a well done project.
Firstly, I'm a little puzzled why, when the title of the paper says it's a case study of Patna, but the actual study is confined only to slums. Now, it can't be anybody's case that Patna is all about slums. Therefore, I think the title needs to be revised to say case study of select slums, not even all slums, because we don't know whether the ones that are chosen are necessarily representative of all. Quite likely to be, but not necessarily. Secondly, in the case of slums, what the paper seems to point to is that a lot of violence is related to conflict over facilities, tightness of space, and all the rest of it, which is very different from crime. Abduction is a crime where you hurt or harm someone not because there's any personal conflict, not because you're fighting over a tap of water and who will fill the water first, but because you wish to harm the person for personal gain. And to my mind, crime and conflict, social conflict, need to be separated. That in the process or in the course of a conflict over water or toilets, you might hit someone and the head might start bleeding, and then it might become a Hindu-Muslim thing, is different. And then politicians jump in to communalize it, is a different story. But that can't be per se. Social conflict and crime cannot be treated as synonymous. And to my mind, that these need to be separated, because the crime that Patna became once famous for during Lalu regime or even a little earlier, I don't think Lalu invented it, but of course he gave big fillip to it,